Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Nancy Drew. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, obviously, Nancy going to a florist shop ends up, with a little, assistance from Ace, ends up finding out about AJ because it turns out the number is actually connected to her dad because he's actually the one that kind of helps drop off all those flowers. So she has a meetup with her dad. He's thinking like, hey, we're going to talk about everything. It's like, no, AJ. Are you connected to the five that died? It's like AJ. Actually, his name, he actually goes by the name AJ Crane. I was like, wait, the horror novelist, which is interesting because last episode, and I forgot to bring this up because I loved it so much, was Nick's mom bringing up the fact is that Stephen King wrote so many books talking about, and she's like, yeah, there are ghosts in Maine, and Stephen King has talked about it. Which, side note, I've never read every Stephen King thing. I've never watched everything that's been adapted from it, but I forgot a lot of stuff takes place in Maine. I know it takes place in Maine, even though it's a little different. The Colorado Kid takes place in Maine. I mean, Haven, which I think parts of Colorado, I think the Colorado Kid takes place in Maine. I know definitely Haven takes place in Maine, and it's loosely based on the book. I believe The Mist takes place in Maine as well. So regardless, I think that was just like the whole point. I just love that bit from last episode. But now it's like, oh, we find out that AJ's actually a horror novelist. So I thought that was kind of interesting, like the ties in that situation. But he's also kind of a bit of recluse. So Nancy drives up there with her dad because he was like, I won't give you the address, but I'll drive you there. And he's like, oh, it was a quiet drive. She's like, what? And he doesn't even say anything. Luckily, they do get to meet with AJ, but AJ immediately kind of Nancy still hasn't told her dad about everything that's going down. So it's like, hey, how did you get around it? Because I was really curious about it. And for him, it's like, you don't want to go down the path I did. I was like, no, what's that all about? And then eventually she ends up stealing a charm. Sadly for her, that charm ended up not being what she thought it was. It turns out in actuality, it's something that attracts ghosts, and that ends up how you being the means in which AJ repels. I thought that was interesting because at first I was like, did he have to sacrifice one of his friends or something like that? It's like, no. By basically using this thing to attract basically the most evil, malevolent spirits, it basically keeps the Aglika at bay, which I wonder how that works. I guess if you're surrounded by so much malice and other spirit, it makes it hard for Galika to get close to you, or at least it kind of, maybe it outshines her own malice towards you. Maybe it's just like they create basically a ghost barrier with their malevolence and stuff that it's hard to penetrate that, so she can't come after you. But it involves basically being haunted every day in your life by the most malevolent spirits that get summoned. So not much of a life. And AJ's apparently been living like this for the past 40 odd years, sadly enough. It is sad that he ended up getting arrested because he was calling up Drew Carson to, hey, where's Nancy at? And he kind of looked at it as a potential threat. Because he realized hey, he wasn't that, because Carson took it as whoa, are you threatening my daughter? It's like, no, I'm not trying to threaten your daughter. Just, you guys got to get out of here. But now on top of this, he's thinking he's looking for my daughter. Yeah, he's the most recluse person. He's not the most stable person. And now he's thinking probably coming after Nancy. So he has him arrested later on because Tamura shows up and arrests him, which is a bummer because it's maybe if Nancy had filled her dad in on certain things, because even he doesn't really know all the supernatural stuff that's going on, does he? I know Ryan does, but I don't think he does. He's had interaction with the supernatural, but it's happened behind him. I don't think he's had a direct, a face-to-face interaction. Not that I can remember, necessarily. Like I said, I know Ryan had a few encounters last season. Mainly, it's this crew that has had Nancy and her friends that have had the biggest encounters face-to-face. But, we did get a lot of interesting information about how this whole thing came about, what sparked them to call to the Aglika. And it turns out Hannah, the librarian they go to, I thought that was so interesting bringing that back full circle, where it's the car crash where she got the burns, it's where her parents died. And she wasn't because she was I think they said she was 3 at the time. So she was most likely not going to make it. So they, out of guilt, they all summoned the Aglika to help save her. But because they didn't pay the price, they ended up suffering the ramifications, and all of his friends died. And so he's been protecting himself this entire time with this totem thing to, like I said, summon all these malevolent spirits so the Aglika can't come after him, you know? But another thing in this episode is a potential plan that Bess came up with, because she was actually looking into it. It's like, maybe if we give the Aglaika back what it gave us, then maybe it'll take away the curse. In this particular case, it's giving away Lucy's bones. Now, Ace was talking to her like, all right, so you want to offer it Nancy's dead mom? There wasn't too much conversation beyond that, but I'm like, yeah, you went through a lot of trouble to get those bones, but to be fair, it cost you a lot anyway. I mean, Owen was going to be the sacrifice, but then like, oh, you ended up saving him, granted. And which is sad, because he ultimately ended up dying anyway. You can almost, it wasn't necessarily the Aglaika, but I think at the end of the day, it was kind of, especially him being a Marvin. That's why I'm thinking like the best thing is kind of interesting, considering you think it'd probably have well, maybe that's why she's the one that burns. Because I'm wondering, does it have something to do with it? Because, everyone has a brutal death. Nancy's falling to her death like her mom. George and Nick drown. Ace gets the hook, but she burns alive. At the very least, it seems like burns alive. So I'm like, part of me wonders, is she technically getting the harshest punishment? You know, I'm sure that's debatable. But I was just wondering, like, you would think as a Marvin, she'd probably get it the hardest. But I don't know. Maybe it's just because of her relation to the family. She's trying to get closer to the family, but she's always had a little bit of distance. So does that make her a full, true-blown Marvin? So maybe that's why the Aglaika doesn't, have, a major grudge against her, at least in that regard. I don't know. But it is just kind of messed up. It's like, oh yeah, Nancy did all that to find out about her mom, and she even wanted to kind of give her mom a proper burial, but even Bess kind of dropped on her and was like, wait, so you guys have been working on this behind my back? When were you going to tell me? And Bess is like, I'm telling you now. It's like, that is kind of effed up. I get it. It's about self-preservation, saving everyone. But at the same time, it's like, you could have come to Nancy about this first. You knew she wouldn't be too on board with it, because if you figured she would be, you would have told her a lot sooner. So, but it's like, she's just finding out who her mom is. And now it's like, oh, the bones I could have used to bury her. Oh, we got to give them back to the Aglaika. But talking to AJ made her consider it, because it's like, well, he's tried everything and nothing's worked out. So, because for AJ, he said at the very least, he's an orphan, so he doesn't really have too many ties. So his need to survive comes first and foremost, because he's not looking out for anyone. Because for Nancy, it's not just about her own self-preservation. That's one thing. Because not at least, his other friends are dead. But for Nancy, her friends are alive as well, so she has to find a solution that's not just for her, it's for them. And once again, Nancy's putting their well-being before her own. I think if it was necessary, Nancy would sacrifice herself if it meant saving her friends. Because I'm sure she blames herself. Well, she kind of does blame herself for, setting this all in motion, So her need to find the truth kind of put them all in. I mean, granted, she discovered the truth, but, sadly, at what price, at what cost? And, there's always kind of a cost with the truth. Granted, I'm sure she wasn't expecting there to be a literal supernatural cost, but maybe it should have been kind of obvious considering all the supernatural stuff that's happened around them over the course of the series so far. But what I also thought was interesting, maybe that came up at near the end of last season, but I didn't remember. I feel like I vaguely remember Tamura picking up the skull, because it turns out it's like, oh, I tried to hide it, and it's like, I thought you had it. Ace was like, I don't have it. I thought you had it. It's like, then Tamura has it. It was like, okay. So, but, Ace, a little indirectly brings it up. It's like, oh yeah, that human skull he found, and the cop was like, what human skull? And it's like, wait, so Tamura hasn't put it in evidence? Why? And even Ace found it in his desk, which later on he shows up at Ace's when his dad was like, oh, let's have dinner for Shabbat. And it's like, oh, he, kind of brought himself over, which Ace was kind of like, I've got stuff to do. But his dad's like, oh, we could always do it next Friday. But it's like, they've got 3 days left. So it's like, no, let's not waste time. This might be my best chance at just spending some time with you, because, I don't want it to be like, the last time we could have spent together, I wasn't there. Especially because Ace said the fact is being home isn't all that great, because his mom's away, and obviously him and his dad it's actually interesting because he talks about him and his dad arguing a bit, but it's like when we actually see them on screen together, it's not that bad. But I guess it's like they don't 100% see eye to eye on a lot of stuff, so maybe that's what it is. Because it's like their relationship seems pretty okay. But I mean, I guess that's we see things when things are good. Just because you see things when they're good doesn't mean they're not bad when they're bad. When you're not around to look at them, so. But he had decided to go by, enjoy Shabbat with his dad. But lo and behold, Tamura was there. And I love the whole thing of Ace being like, no, why doesn't, Tamura? And he's like, yeah. He's like, wait, are you Jewish? It's like, yeah, I'm half Jewish. Which is also interesting because we actually found out, like, Ace's dad, the moment he met Ace's mom, he actually converted, But it's like, it turns out it was, I forgot what it was, the thing that he's supposed to be saying, and he says it perfectly, and he's like, if you want to, I can sing it. And it's like, and I love Ace being like, no, he couldn't hear it, and you look hungry, so let's just jump on top. But Tamura's like, I know you have the skull. But that is the thing, like, why didn't he report it? Because he found it at the restaurant, so I'm assuming he, for one, didn't find out whose body it was. Because if he did, that'd probably open up a whole bunch of questions, because you can't blame them for something that happened literally before most of them were born. They were all kids at the time, so, but still, it would have been, because he's trying to find some dirt on it, because it's like, you guys are neck deep in all this stuff. You have a human skull. I know you guys are up to something, so he's trying to pin that on them. But Ace's dad has his back, and it's like, you're going to need a warrant. This is my house, so, and my son has my protection. He has my trust. So if you want something, you better go get a warrant. Tomorrow's like, all right, thanks for dinner. And Ace's dad like, what are you into? It's like, I'm in trouble, but we're going to try and fix it. He's like, you fix it, you come home to me, and then you explain things, So that's Ace's side of things. It's actually interesting. The one person we never really got to see because, I guess I'm curious if they probably won't make a workaround for that. Because, like, only thing Bess would have going for right now, because, it's not like she has family in town, and the whole Elizabeth situation is kind of where it is, so... I forgot, like, what happened. Because wasn't Elizabeth still being, like, her aunt's chauffeur or whatever? Because I don't remember, or did she get a transfer? I don't remember what happened with the whole, like, Elizabeth and her thing. I know they had to put it on her. I think it was, like, so that she could keep her cover, but that might have been earlier in the season. I don't remember, like, being undercover with the Marvins and stuff like that. But regardless... because I'm about to say, like, she didn't really spend time with, like, Nancy and her friends are, like, the only people she can really spend time with. But, George and Nick are trying to figure things out about, like, it's like, well, for one, trying to find him a place to stay. But he's like, what's the point of finding a place to stay? I don't even know if I'm going to be alive after the next 3 days. Obviously for them, it's like, for George, it's like, I don't really care that much about it, but it's like, we need to have something to hold on to so that we're not just like scrambling because of all this stuff that's going down. And it's like, we need to find a place. It's like, it's like all the stuff we don't get to do, like the anniversary of our first kiss and stuff like that. Him like saying like, oh yeah, let's wake up in bed and say like who took most of the cover. And it's like, yeah, even going to bed. And it's like, oh, and then they proceed to start heavily making out. And then Nancy walks in and it's just like, this is awkward. Yes, she's happy for you, but that doesn't mean she has to be happy about walking in. Weren't they at her house too? Maybe not. I think so, because they were like, oh my God, sorry, Nancy, we'll get out of your hair. I'm pretty sure that was at her house, which makes that even more twisted. Because it's like, oh, he was staying at George's. It definitely was Nancy's place, because he was staying at Nancy's place. I forgot. So yeah, it's like, that could have picked a better place. Like, I get it. You got caught up in the moment. That's still super awkward to get caught in that position, but I love when they try to send Lucy's bones back. And I love that it's like Glaika, and then George is like back there talking mad shit about that Glaika, and Bess is like, stop it, And so Nancy offering up her own blood, the Glaika takes the bones. It's like, hey, maybe we've saved the day. But then they find out that AJ escaped prison. And it's like the direction he's going, it's Hannah. So he got the same idea from them, because he was like, you do whatever you got to do to survive. Like, he couldn't find a solution after all these years, but it's like, hey, maybe you can find one. And so his decision is to try and kill Hannah, because it's like, in particular, trying to kill her the same way she was supposed to die in that car fire. But, Nancy luckily shows up to stop him, because it's like, this isn't going to, it's like, you think this is going to free you, but it's just going to haunt you even more, because, it might stop the Glaika, but even if it does, you're still going to be haunted by your own demons. And luckily she was able to talk him down. But when it was all said and done, he left the thing with her, and she's like, you need this. And he's like, no, like, because for him, it's like spending his entire life alone trying to survive like this has been hell for him. It's like, being haunted by your own demons, both literally and figuratively, for these past 40 some years. It's like, that's no way to live. You're pretty much dead in your own right. So, he says, whatever the Glaika wants to do with what's left of me, so be it. So it's like, hey, maybe things worked out for us. Maybe we made good with the Glaika. Nope. Come back, find Lucy's bones, and the place is completely and utterly trashed. It's like, damn. So that didn't work out. Plus, they end up finding out, hey, sadly, AJ died. The Glaika finally caught up to him, and apparently he died just like his character does in the last book he wrote. Because even Bess being like, oh yeah, I love that. But I even love like when they were stopping AJ. She's like, oh my god, AJ, great. I love you. I'm a big fan of yours. And Nancy's like, not now. Read the room. Now, read the situation, Bess. So it's like, hey, it didn't work out for AJ, and, he never found a solution. His one solution, not the best solution. You basically will be haunted for the rest of your life, and that's not living at all. We also have George and Nick finally doing their thing, because initially they were going to do it in a hotel, but obviously for George, anytime she closes her eyes, she thinks about it. Like, much like she was trying to get Nick's mind off of things, she was trying to get her mind off of things too. It terrified her, because obviously it's like, well, to be fair, George had that whole thing with the blood bucket about like saying that she was going to die within the year. So we never correlated that necessarily that it's tied. I mean, maybe this Glaika thing maybe that was foreshadowing this Glaika thing. To be fair, she's the only one that had a bucket of blood, so it's like almost make you think like maybe George is the one. No, but hopefully that's not the case. That maybe she's the only one that ends up dying out of the bunch. I hope that's not the case. But then, because you would think maybe everyone else would have gotten a bucket of blood, that would have been a sign, but maybe that would have been too foreshadowing, or maybe it's insinuating there's a Glaika thing. It's one thing, that blood bucket, it's a completely other thing, So maybe that's what that's kind of implying too. I don't think that came up last season, because it said within the year, so it was at any point in time. But I was like, I don't think that. Once again, I'm blanking, but I don't. Let me know in the comments down below. But I don't think anything death related happened to George. That was correlated to that blood bucket. I don't think anything of that nature happened. I think the Glaika is like the closest thing to that. So I'd assume that's what that was representing. But like I said, maybe that's something else later on in the storyline. Regardless of all of that, George got fed up, because for her, she's like, I'm not going to live the rest of the little time we have left living in fear. I'm screw the Glaika. And so they decide to take back, their lives. And so they do it in a truck. We're not going to let the truck just be our fear. Like, even if we're going to die in there, like, we're not going to live that time in fear. So they do their thing, which Ace is like, I forgot what he was saying when him and Bess came knocking on the window. But nevertheless, the situation did bring Nancy, kind of like thoughts about like kind of having some form of peace. So what she ends up doing is going to her dad and saying, hey, I want to bury Lucy. So she invites him and Ryan out, which obviously that's kind of an awkward moment. The last interaction Ryan and Carson had was not a pleasant one. So some threats were made. But it's a situation where it's like, this is for Lucy's sake, but also it's for Nancy's sake. And obviously they both care about, her. I even love Ryan ended up helping her meet with AJ, because it's like, he's like, oh, like, it's like, oh, this is not surprising, because every time you show up, you want a favor. And she's like, well, think about all the times, like all the braces you didn't have to pay for, or dance classes, or presents, or me asking to take the car out for a ride. So I thought that was kind of a neat moment. I'm curious to see, if there going to be any, like, building a relationship between them. Like, obviously, like, Nancy kind of keeps him at a distance. I'm assuming Tamura is going to be one of the ones who ends up potentially, like, it getting revealed that, because he wouldn't be able to, consider they've buried the bones, not unless he ends up finding them later on. But I'm saying, like, the fact is that I was wondering if he's going to be the one that ends up discovering the whole Nancy being Lucy's child, Ryan's child, because then it's going to open up that whole can of worms. Not unless Ryan gets pissed at Carson at one point in time and reports that to Tamura, and then even tells him where Lucy was buried, which would be kind of effed up, considering that is the person you love, mother of your child. Like, would you do that to? I don't know. I'd be so curious. I mean, in general, I'm curious where Nancy is going to stand with her dad now. Granted, they're down to 2 days at this point in time, so I'm sure it puts a certain perspective on things for you. So it's like, yeah, things are still awkward around her dad, but she might make more of an attempt with not just him, but also Ryan. I wonder, did they fill Hannah in on about the circumstances of, her situation? I'm curious how she feels about it, knowing like, oh yeah, all the people responsible for your parents dying are dead, including AJ, but also learning that they're also the reason why you survived. Because I'm sure maybe in the grand scheme of things, she might actually feel a little sorry for them to a certain extent. I don't know. I would have loved to kind of or eventually get her perspective on it if they filled her in about everything, because they might be like, I don't know. I'm curious to like what kind of conversation they had about that, if any at all. But obviously, the final thing is them burying that charm, because it's like, yeah, way out here where no one comes anyway, so we don't have to worry about the ghost hurting anyone. But it's like, all right, gather up everything that we can, because the spirits are closing in. We need to get everything AJ was working on, including what is essentially a trap for the Aglika that he just never finished. I'm curious, why did he never finish? Never found like the certain materials, or maybe never found the right spells to kind of enact it. Whatever the case may be, our crew is desperate and is looking for any potential solution for this. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see where all this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. The next week's episode would be episode 22. So I'm assuming that will make this what was originally supposed to be the season 1 finale. So I'm curious what's going to go down, and obviously like what this sets up for the next arc of the season, because everything is dealing with mainly this Aglika stuff. It's all kind of resolving that story arc before we kind of jump into the next one. Like I said, with a lot of shows, and in particular a lot of the CW stuff. But it's going to be interesting to see where it all takes us. But really, that's all I'm going to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.